August 7, 1985. The Essex countryside was quiet. Fields stretched endlessly around a large, detached farmhouse known locally as White House Farm. It was the kind of place where nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen. No traffic noise. No city chaos. Just wind through crops and distant farm machinery. Inside that house lived a family that, from the outside, looked stable and respectable. The parents were Neville Bamber and June Bamber, hardworking, conservative, known in the community. They had adopted 2 children years earlier, their son Jeremy Bamber and their daughter Sheila Caffell. On that night, Sheila was staying at the farmhouse with her 6-year-old twin boys. By sunrise, all 5 would be dead. The 3:26 a.m. phone call. At approximately 3:26 a.m., police receive a call from Jeremy Bamber. He claimed his father had phoned him moments earlier, terrified. According to Jeremy, his father said Sheila had gone berserk with a gun and was shooting inside the house. Jeremy said the line went dead. Police treated it as an emergency firearm situation. Officers were dispatched to White House Farm. It was dark, remote. They approached cautiously. When they arrived, the house was silent. No screams, no movement, just stillness. Because of the reported firearm inside, officers waited outside for backup before entering. The delay would later become one of the most debated aspects of the case. Eventually, police entered the farmhouse. What they found inside would shock Britain. Inside the house, the first bodies discovered were Neville and June Bamber. Both had been shot. Upstairs, the scene grew even more disturbing. Sheila Caffell lay dead. So did her 2 young sons. All 5 had been shot with a .22 caliber rifle found inside the house. At first glance, investigators believed they were looking at a tragic murder-suicide. Sheila had a documented history of severe mental illness, including schizophrenia. She had previously experienced psychotic episodes. The initial theory seemed to fit: a breakdown, violence, and then suicide. The rifle was near her body. Case closed? Not quite. The early assumption. In the first days after the killings, newspapers reported a horrifying but simple narrative. A mentally ill woman had killed her family and herself. The story generated sympathy and tragedy headlines, but not suspicion. Jeremy Bamber, the surviving son, appeared composed in media interviews. He spoke of shock, of grief, of disbelief. He did not appear frantic. He did not appear unstable. To many observers, he looked like a devastated family member trying to process unimaginable loss. But behind the scenes, small details began to bother investigators. The silencer question. The .22 rifle had a sound moderator attached, essentially a silencer. But forensic analysis raised a troubling issue. Evidence suggested the silencer may not have been fitted during the shootings. More critically, Sheila's fatal wound made it physically difficult to explain how she could have reattached the silencer after shooting herself. If she didn't reattach it, who did? That question changed everything. Because if someone staged the weapon after the killings, the murder-suicide theory collapses instantly. The timeline problem. Another issue emerged: the timeline. Jeremy claimed his father had called him during the attack, but telephone records and reconstruction of events raised doubts about whether that call could have happened the way he described. Some officers began questioning whether Jeremy had arrived at the farm before police, and whether he had more time inside the house than initially believed. The investigation slowly shifted focus. From tragedy to suspicion. The inheritance motive. White House Farm was valuable property. The Bamber family estate was worth hundreds of thousands of pounds in 1985, equivalent to far more today. If Neville and June died, and if Sheila were blamed for the murders, the estate would pass to Jeremy. Financial motive is not proof, but it is powerful context. Investigators began examining Jeremy's finances, relationships, and past statements. Some witnesses later claimed he had spoken about expecting the inheritance. Suddenly, the only surviving family member looked less like a victim of circumstance and more like a potential beneficiary. Public shock. As whispers of suspicion spread, public reaction intensified. The idea that a man might murder his own parents, sister, and 6-year-old nephews for money was horrifying. Britain in the mid-1980s was not unfamiliar with violent crime. But this case struck differently. It was rural, domestic, intimate. It wasn't a gang killing. It wasn't random. If it was murder, It was betrayal at the deepest level. And betrayal unsettles people more than chaos. The psychological contrast. Two possible stories existed. Story 1. Sheila suffered a catastrophic psychotic episode, killed her family, then herself. A devastating mental health tragedy. Story 2. Jeremy murdered everyone, staged the scene, and attempted to blame his mentally ill sister. One is tragic. The other is calculated. The line between those two possibilities would define the investigation from that moment forward. The farm becomes a crime scene. White House Farm was sealed off. Forensic teams combed through every room. Ballistics experts analyzed the rifle. Blood pattern specialists examined walls and floors. Each small detail mattered. Every inconsistency chipped away at the original narrative. Investigators began to believe this was not a spontaneous breakdown. It was something else. Something planned. The morning after the bodies were discovered at White House Farm, the official tone was still cautious. 5 people were dead. The country was horrified. And the surviving son, Jeremy Bamber, appeared to be grieving. But inside Essex Police Headquarters, something had shifted. The original assumption, that Sheila Caffell had suffered a psychotic episode and killed her family, was no longer solid. It was cracking under scrutiny. And when a theory begins to crack, investigators start looking for who benefits. The silencer that changed everything. The .22 rifle found inside the farmhouse had a sound moderator attached. Forensic testing soon became the turning point of the entire investigation. Experts examined blood traces inside the silencer. What they discovered raised serious doubts about the murder-suicide scenario. If Sheila had shot herself in the throat while holding the rifle, the blood pattern suggested the silencer should have contained heavy biological residue consistent with being attached at the moment of the fatal shot. But that wasn't what they found. Instead, blood patterns suggested the silencer may have been attached afterward. That detail was explosive, because Sheila, having suffered a fatal wound, could not have reattached it herself. If someone reattached the silencer after the shootings, then someone else had been inside that house after the killings. And that someone would almost certainly be the only surviving family member. The timeline revisited. Investigators went back to the early morning phone call Jeremy made to police. He had claimed that his father, Neville Bamber, called him during the attack, screaming that Sheila was shooting. But reconstruction of the timeline introduced problems. Phone records suggested the alleged call from Neville may not have happened in the way Jeremy described. Officers also began questioning why Jeremy had not immediately rushed into the house if he believed his family was under attack. Instead, he waited outside with police. Some officers began to wonder, was he waiting because he knew what was inside, or because he needed police present before anyone entered? These were not accusations yet, but they were doubts. And doubt in a murder investigation spreads quickly. The financial picture. As detectives expanded their focus, they examined Jeremy's financial situation. White House Farm was valuable. The land alone represented significant wealth. Under the family's will structure, if Neville and June died, and if Sheila were responsible for the murders, the estate would pass to Jeremy. Inheritance does not prove murder, but it establishes motive. And motive gives investigators direction. Friends and acquaintances were interviewed. Some later claimed Jeremy had spoken about expecting the estate. Others described him as ambitious, even restless with rural life. Still, nothing at this stage was definitive. It was circumstantial. But circumstantial evidence, when layered carefully, can build a powerful case. The girlfriend's intervention. The case intensified when Jeremy's then-girlfriend came forward with statements that would dramatically alter the investigation. She alleged that Jeremy had made comments implying knowledge of the killings before they became public. More importantly, she provided police with a rifle silencer, claiming Jeremy had asked her to hide it. That silencer became one of the most controversial pieces of evidence in British criminal history. Forensic tests were conducted. Traces found inside it became central to the prosecution theory that Jeremy had used it during the killings and later manipulated its placement. The defense would later challenge this fiercely. But in the investigation phase, it was a turning point. Police no longer viewed Jeremy as a grieving son. He was now their prime suspect. Reconstructing the night, detectives began constructing a new narrative of what might have happened on August 7, 1985. In this version, Jeremy drives to White House Farm late at night. He shoots his parents first, possibly to eliminate resistance. He then kills Sheila and the children. He stages the rifle near Sheila's body to suggest murder-suicide. He calls police, claiming his father phoned him in terror. This theory explained the silencer issue. It explained the inheritance. It explained the inconsistencies in his statements. But building a theory is not enough. It must survive court. The arrest. In September 1985, roughly 1 month after the murders, Jeremy Bamber was arrested and charged with 5 counts of murder. The arrest stunned the public. At first, Britain had mourned a mentally ill woman's breakdown. Now, the possibility of a calculated family annihilation dominated headlines. Media coverage intensified. Newspapers ran photos of White House farm. Commentators debated the forensic details. Was the police theory solid? Or were they reconstructing events to fit suspicion? The case was no longer quiet. It was national. The psychological divide. 2 sharply different narratives now existed. Prosecution theory. Jeremy was motivated by money, resentment, or personal ambition. He carefully planned the murders and staged the scene. Defense theory. Sheila, with a documented history of schizophrenia, suffered a psychotic episode and carried out the killings herself. Psychiatric history became central. Medical records were examined. Experts debated whether Sheila was capable of such violence. The prosecution argued her condition had been stable. The defense argued mental illness can escalate unpredictably. The courtroom would eventually become a battlefield of interpretation. Public opinion splits. As the case moved toward trial, public opinion began dividing. Some believed the police narrative made sense. The silencer detail felt damning. The inheritance motive felt strong. Others were uneasy. Could someone really murder his entire family, including young children, with such cold precision? And if so, why call police at all? The brutality of the crime made it hard to imagine as calculated. Yet financial motive and forensic detail made it difficult to dismiss. The tension between emotional disbelief and logical reconstruction defined public reaction. Building the prosecution case. Prosecutors worked methodically. They focused on a forensic analysis of the rifle and silencer, a blood pattern inconsistencies, a financial motive, a witness testimony from Jeremy's girlfriend, timeline contradictions. They argued that Sheila's fatal wound made it physically impossible for her to have staged the rifle after shooting herself. They emphasized Jeremy's calm demeanor in interviews, suggesting composure inconsistent with sudden family tragedy. The case was complex, but the prosecution believed it was cohesive. The defense strategy. Jeremy's defense team prepared to dismantle each point. They argued the silencer evidence was mishandled. A police developed tunnel vision early. Sheila's psychiatric history provided a clear explanation. Witness testimony was unreliable and potentially motivated by personal conflict. They framed the investigation as biased. Claiming once police suspected Jeremy, they interpreted every detail through that lens. This would become a theme lasting decades. Emotional weight. Behind legal arguments were 5 lives lost. Neville and June Bamber. Sheila Caffell. 2 6-year-old boys. Whatever the truth, the devastation was undeniable. And that emotional weight hung over every development. Britain wasn't just watching a legal case. It was watching a story about trust, inheritance, mental illness, and betrayal unfold in real time. The stage is set. By late 1985, the transformation was complete. White House Farm was no longer a tragic murder-suicide site. It was the center of one of the most controversial homicide cases in British history. Jeremy Bamber awaited trial. Prosecutors believed they had a calculated killer. The defense insisted they had a miscarriage of justice in the making. The courtroom would decide. But the debate had already begun. And once a case divides a nation, the verdict rarely ends the argument. By October 1986, more than a year after the murders at White House Farm, the case reached its most dramatic stage. The trial of Jeremy Bamber began at Chelmsford Crown Court. 5 counts of murder. 5 victims. 1 surviving son in the dock. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was heavy. This was no ordinary homicide case. It involved an entire family wiped out in a single night, including 2 6-year-old boys. The press benches were full. Public curiosity had turned into national obsession. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited. Inside, The battle for truth began. The prosecution's story. The prosecution presented a clear, calculated narrative. Jeremy Bamber, they argued, was motivated by money. White House Farm and the surrounding estate were worth a significant sum. Under the terms of the family's will, if Neville Bamber and June Bamber died, and if Sheila Caffell was responsible for the killings, Jeremy would inherit everything. According to prosecutors, Jeremy planned the murders carefully. They alleged he entered the farmhouse late at night armed with a .22 rifle fitted with a silencer. He killed his parents first. Then he shot Sheila and her 2 sons. Afterward, he staged the scene to look like a murder-suicide by placing the rifle near Sheila's body. Finally, he called police and fabricated a story about his father phoning him in panic. The silencer became the centerpiece of the prosecution case. Forensic experts testified that blood patterns inside the sound moderator suggested it had been attached after the fatal shot to Sheila. Because Sheila had suffered a severe wound to the throat, they argued she would not have been physically capable of reattaching the silencer. Therefore, someone else must have done it. And that someone, they argued, was Jeremy. The girlfriend's testimony. Perhaps the most damaging evidence came from Jeremy's former girlfriend. She told the court that Jeremy had spoken about killing his family for inheritance money. She also testified that he had given her a silencer to hide after the murders. That silencer was handed to police and introduced as key evidence. The prosecution portrayed her testimony as proof of both motive and post-crime behavior. The defense, however, attacked her credibility. They suggested she was bitter after the end of their relationship. They questioned her memory and her motives. They implied she had reasons to exaggerate or even fabricate details. But to the jury, her statements added a human element to the forensic theory. It wasn't just science anymore. It was personal. The defense's counterattack. Jeremy Bamber's legal team built their case around one central argument. Sheila Caffell was responsible. They reminded the jury that Sheila had a documented history of schizophrenia. She had previously experienced psychotic episodes. Medical records showed serious mental health struggles. The defense argued that on the night of August 7, 1985, Sheila suffered a catastrophic breakdown. They suggested she killed her parents, shot her children, and then turned the gun on herself. The presence of the rifle near her body supported that theory, they argued. They challenged the forensic interpretation of the silencer, suggesting contamination or investigative error. They implied police had quickly developed tunnel vision, focusing on Jeremy and interpreting all evidence through that lens. The defense also emphasized Jeremy's behavior after the murders. He had called police. He had not fled. He had cooperated with investigators. Would a calculated killer willingly bring police to the scene? That question lingered. The emotional impact. The courtroom frequently returned to the brutality of the crime. Photographs were shown. Details of the gunshot wounds were described. The deaths of Sheila's young sons deeply affected those present. The jury had to look beyond emotion and focus on evidence. But emotion is impossible to ignore in a case like this. The idea that a son could murder his parents and nephews for financial gain was chilling. The idea that a mentally ill mother could kill her own children was equally devastating. Both narratives were tragic, but only one could be legally accepted. The judge's direction. As the trial neared its conclusion, the judge instructed the jury carefully. They were told to weigh forensic evidence objectively. They were reminded that motive alone does not prove guilt. They were warned not to let sympathy or horror cloud judgment. The jury retired to deliberate. Outside, media speculation intensified. Inside, the future of Jeremy Bamber rested on 12 citizens. The verdict. After deliberation, the jury returned. Guilty. On all 5 counts. Jeremy Bamber was sentenced to life imprisonment. Later, his sentence was classified as a whole life order, meaning he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The courtroom reaction was subdued but powerful. For supporters of the prosecution, justice had been served. For those who doubted the case, it felt like the beginning of a long legal battle. Aftermath and controversy. Even as Jeremy was led away, the controversy did not end. Almost immediately, questions surfaced in media discussions and among legal commentators. Was the forensic evidence interpreted correctly? Was the girlfriend's testimony fully reliable? Had investigators dismissed the murder-suicide theory too quickly? Jeremy Bamber himself maintained his innocence from a moment of conviction. Over the following decades, he would launch multiple appeals. Each would fail. Yet the debate never disappeared. White House Farm became shorthand in Britain for a case that refuses to rest quietly. The broader impact. The trial marked a turning point in how high-profile murder cases were discussed in British media. It highlighted the growing role of forensic science in courtrooms. It raised questions about investigative bias, and it cemented White House Farm as one of the most haunting crime scenes in modern British history. 5 lives ended in a remote farmhouse, 1 man imprisoned for their deaths, and a country still divided over whether the right conclusion was reached. When the jury returned its guilty verdict in 1986, the courtroom drama appeared to end. 5 murders, 5 life sentences. Case closed. But for Jeremy Bamber, the legal battle was only beginning. From the moment he entered prison, he maintained a single, unwavering claim. I am innocent. And over the decades that followed, that claim would fuel one of the most persistent appeal campaigns in British criminal history. Life behind bars. After conviction, Jeremy was transferred into the British prison system to save what would eventually become a whole-life order. That meant no fixed release date, no parole expectation, prison for the remainder of his life. But unlike many convicted murderers who retreat into silence, Jeremy became active. He wrote letters. He contacted journalists. He corresponded with supporters. He studied the evidence from his trial obsessively. He argued that police had made critical errors in the investigation of White House Farm. He claimed forensic conclusions were flawed. He insisted that key evidence had been misinterpreted. His central argument never changed. His sister, Sheila Caffell, had suffered a psychotic episode and killed the family. To Jeremy, the original murder-suicide theory was correct, and police had abandoned it too quickly. The appeal strategy. Appeals in serious criminal cases are not simple retrials. They focus on legal errors, new evidence, or procedural failures that may have affected the safety of the conviction. Jeremy's legal team targeted several areas. The forensic interpretation of the rifle silencer. The credibility of witness testimony. Alleged inconsistencies in blood pattern analysis. A police handling of the crime scene. The silencer remained the most controversial issue. At trial, prosecutors argued that blood inside the sound moderator proved it had been attached after Sheila's fatal wound, meaning she could not have staged the scene herself. Jeremy's supporters countered that contamination or misinterpretation could explain those findings. They claimed the forensic conclusions were overstated. The appeal courts, however, consistently upheld the conviction. Public support grows. As years passed, a small but vocal group of supporters emerged. Some believed Jeremy had been wrongly convicted. Others believed the investigation was deeply flawed. They pointed to what they saw as inconsistencies in police testimony and forensic handling. Campaigners organized petitions. They analyzed trial transcripts. They raised funds for legal efforts. In Britain, wrongful conviction campaigns have a powerful cultural presence. Cases like the Birmingham 6 and Guildford 4 had previously exposed serious miscarriages of justice. That historical context made some observers cautious about dismissing Jeremy's claims outright. But skepticism also remained strong. Many believed the jury's decision had been sound. The Criminal Cases Review Commission. In 1997, Britain established the Criminal Cases Review Commission, CCRC, an independent body designed to investigate potential miscarriages of justice. Jeremy's case was eventually submitted for review. Supporters hoped this new body might uncover overlooked evidence or procedural mistakes. The CCRC examined materials, including forensic reports and police documentation. After review, they referred aspects of the case back to the Court of Appeal in the early 2000s. This was a significant moment. It suggested that, at minimum, questions existed worth judicial reconsideration. But reconsideration does not guarantee reversal. The Court of Appeal decision. The Court of Appeal carefully re-examined arguments surrounding the silencer and forensic interpretation. Defense teams argued that the blood evidence had been misunderstood and that expert testimony at the original trial was misleading. Prosecutors defended the conviction, maintaining that the totality of evidence, not just the silencer, supported guilt. After deliberation, the court dismissed the appeal. They concluded that the conviction remained safe. For Jeremy, It was another devastating blow. For his supporters, it reinforced their belief that the system was unwilling to admit error. For victims' relatives, it reaffirmed justice. Media reignites the debate. In 2020, decades after the murders, the case returned to national attention through the television drama White House Farm. The series dramatized the investigation and trial, presenting the prosecution narrative in detailed form. For a new generation, the White House Farm murders were no longer a distant headline. They were a vivid, emotional story unfolding episode by episode. Some viewers emerged convinced of Jeremy's guilt. Others found themselves questioning aspects of the case. True crime culture had evolved since the 1980s. Audiences were now more accustomed to examining forensic nuance, investigative bias, and legal complexity. The debate intensified once again. The whole life order challenge. Jeremy also challenged his whole life tariff, the sentence that ensured he would never be released. In the United Kingdom, whole life orders are reserved for the most serious crimes. Jeremy argued that such a sentence was excessive and incompatible with human rights principles. The courts reviewed the sentence but ultimately upheld it. The reasoning was clear. 5 murders, including 2 children, justified the most severe penalty available. Legally, the door to freedom appeared closed. The psychological toll. Spending decades in prison while maintaining innocence carries psychological weight. Jeremy has given interviews from prison over the years, consistently asserting he was wrongly convicted. He describes frustration, anger, and determination. Critics argue that maintaining innocence can be a coping mechanism for long-term inmates. Supporters argue that his consistency strengthens his credibility. But only one truth exists, and the legal system has declared it settled. The victims in the shadow. Amid appeals and controversy, the victims risk becoming secondary to the legal debate. Neville Bamba, June Bamba, Sheila Caffell, and 2 6-year-old boys whose lives ended before they truly began. For relatives and those who knew them, the legal arguments are distant compared to the loss. Every appeal reopens wounds. Every documentary revives grief. Justice debates often focus on the accused. But tragedy belongs to the victims. Why the case still divides Britain? Several factors keep the controversy alive. The forensic silencer evidence remains complex and technical. The existence of Sheila's documented mental illness creates plausible alternative narrative. The scale of the crime makes it emotionally difficult to process. The persistence of Jeremy's innocence claim fuels doubt. Cases involving family annihilation often resist simple resolution in public consciousness. People search for psychological explanations. They want clarity, but clarity in real life rarely feels as clean as it does in fiction. Where things stand today. As of today, Jeremy Bamba remains in prison serving a whole life sentence. Multiple appeals have failed. The conviction stands. Legally, the matter is closed. But socially, culturally, emotionally, it remains open. White House Farm is no longer just a location in Essex. It is a symbol of betrayal, a symbol of forensic debate, a symbol of how a single night can fracture truth into competing narratives that last generations. By the time the appeals process was underway, one object had become more controversial than any witness, any statement, or any rumor. A .22 caliber rifle. And more specifically, the silencer attached to it. In the case against Jeremy Bamba, forensic science wasn't just supporting evidence. It was the spine of the prosecution's theory. And decades later, it remains the most fiercely debated part of the White House Farm murders. The object at the center, the rifle found inside White House Farm, was fitted with a sound moderator, commonly referred to as a silencer. Sound moderators reduce the noise of gunfire. They are legal under certain circumstances in the UK, particularly in agricultural settings for pest control. On the surface, the presence of a silencer at a rural farm was not unusual. But the condition of that silencer after the murders was. At trial, prosecutors argued that blood patterns inside the device proved it had been attached to the rifle after Sheila Caffell had been shot. And that single detail, if true, destroyed the murder-suicide theory. The prosecution's forensic argument. Here is what the prosecution claimed. If Sheila had shot herself in the throat while holding the rifle with the silencer attached, the blood spray from the wound should have left heavy biological traces inside the sound moderator. But forensic examination revealed that the interior of a silencer did not show expected levels of blood consistent with being attached at the time of the fatal shot. Instead, they argued the pattern suggested it was attached afterward. That meant someone else must have fitted it post-mortem. And the only person who could logically have done that was Jeremy. This was not presented as speculation. It was presented as scientific conclusion. And juries often place enormous weight on scientific testimony. The defense's counter-argument. Jeremy's defense team attacked the forensic conclusions aggressively. They argued that a blood distribution inside a silencer is not perfectly predictable. The crime scene was contaminated by multiple entries. The silencer may have been handled improperly. Testing methods in the mid-1980s were less advanced. They suggested that the absence of heavy blood traces did not conclusively prove post-mortem attachment. They also argued that forensic interpretation is not always absolute. It can be influenced by the assumptions investigators bring into analysis. In other words, if police believed Jeremy was guilty, they might interpret ambiguous evidence in a way that supported that belief. That accusation, investigative tunnel vision, would become central to the long-running debate. Crime scene handling controversy. Supporters of Jeremy have repeatedly pointed to early crime scene management as problematic. White House Farm was entered by officers who believed they were responding to an active firearm situation. The initial priority was safety, not preservation. Multiple individuals moved through the house before full forensic containment was established. Critics argue that this compromised the integrity of certain evidence. For example, was the rifle moved? Was the silencer touched? Were surfaces contaminated? Police have consistently maintained that despite early chaos, the crucial forensic evidence was preserved properly. But once doubt about handling enters public discussion, it lingers. Blood pattern analysis, science or interpretation. Blood pattern analysis was another major element of the case. Experts testified about directionality of blood spray, pooling, and the position of bodies. They reconstructed how each victim was likely shot. The prosecution argued that patterns in Sheila's room contradicted suicide positioning. The defense questioned whether those reconstructions were definitive. Bloodstain pattern analysis, while widely used, involves interpretation. And interpretation can be influenced by context. Modern critics of forensic science often point out that techniques accepted in the 1980s have since been refined or challenged. Supporters of Jeremy argue that if the case were tried today, forensic standards might be different. But appeals courts reviewed those claims and still upheld the conviction. The telephone evidence. Beyond the silencer, another forensic-adjacent issue was the alleged phone call. Jeremy told police his father, Neville Bamber, had called him in panic during the attack. Investigators later questioned whether that call occurred as described. Phone timing and reconstruction raised doubts about the feasibility of the sequence. If Neville never made that call, then Jeremy fabricated it. And if he fabricated it, that strongly suggests staging. The defense maintained that timing discrepancies were explainable. But to prosecutors, the phone call fit into a broader pattern of manipulation. The psychological framing of forensics. One reason the forensic debate remains so powerful is because science feels objective. People tend to believe lab results over human memory. When a case rests heavily on physical evidence, it carries a sense of certainty. But the White House Farm case revealed something deeper. Forensics are interpreted by humans. Humans bring expectations, biases, and frameworks. Supporters argue investigators shifted from neutral inquiry to confirmation mode once Jeremy became suspect. Critics argue the evidence simply pointed toward him. The difference between those interpretations is philosophical as much as factual. Appeals revisited the silencer. When the Criminal Cases Review Commission referred aspects of the case back to the Court of Appeal, the silencer evidence was re-examined carefully. New experts were consulted. Arguments were represented. The Court of Appeal concluded that, even considering fresh analysis, the conviction remained safe. Importantly, the court stated that the case did not rely solely on the silencer. It relied on cumulative evidence, a financial motive, inconsistent statements, a girlfriend testimony, a forensic interpretation, behavioral analysis. That cumulative reasoning made overturning the conviction extremely difficult. Even if one element were weakened, the broader picture still supported guilt in the court's view. Media and modern scrutiny. In the 21st century, public understanding of forensic science has evolved. High-profile miscarriages of justice globally have made audiences more skeptical of scientific certainty. Documentaries and investigative journalists have dissected the White House farm evidence repeatedly. The 2020 dramatization. White House farm reintroduced forensic detail to mainstream viewers. Some walked away convinced. Others felt uneasy. The silencer remains symbolic. It represents the thin line between certainty and doubt. The core question. Everything in Part 5 reduces to one question. Was the silencer attached before or after Sheila's fatal shot? If before, the murder-suicide theory remains plausible. If after, the theory collapses. Courts have ruled the evidence supports post-mortem attachment. Jeremy and his supporters continue to dispute that conclusion. And because no video recording exists, no eyewitness survived, and no confession was obtained, the answer depends entirely on interpretation of physical traces. Why this matters? Forensic controversy doesn't just affect one man. It affects public trust. If the science was solid, the conviction represents justice. If the science was flawed, it represents tragedy layered upon tragedy. White House farm is studied in law schools and criminal justice discussions because it illustrates how a single piece of physical evidence can define an entire narrative, and how decades later, that narrative can still be questioned. By the time forensic arguments had been dissected in courtrooms and appeals, the White House farm case had evolved into something deeper than physical evidence. It became a psychological puzzle. Why would someone commit such a crime? And just as importantly, who was capable of it? At the center of this debate stood one man, Jeremy Bamber. Was he a calculated, financially motivated killer? Or was he a wrongly convicted son living under the shadow of a tragedy caused by mental illness? To understand Part 6, we move away from rifles and silencers. We move into motive, personality, and human dynamics. The family structure. White House farm was not just a physical location. It was a tightly bound family unit shaped by adoption, expectation, and generational tension. Neville Bamber and June Bamber adopted two children, Jeremy and Sheila Caffell, as infants. Outwardly, they were a conventional rural family. But as the children grew older, differences became clear. Sheila struggled with severe mental illness, including diagnosed schizophrenia. Her condition required treatment, supervision, and, at times, hospitalization. Jeremy, on the other hand, was described by acquaintances as intelligent, articulate, and ambitious. He attended boarding school. He experienced life beyond the farm. Some accounts portray him as dissatisfied with rural living. This contrast between siblings, one fragile, one confident, would later influence public perception of motive. The inheritance question revisited. Psychologically, financial motive is complex. Money alone does not automatically create violence. But when money intersects with entitlement, frustration, or perceived injustice, it can fuel resentment. Prosecutors argued that Jeremy expected to inherit White House farm eventually. However, if his parents altered their will in ways that reduced his control, particularly if Sheila or her children became beneficiaries, that expectation could feel threatened. The prosecution theory suggested that the murders were not impulsive. They were strategic. Eliminate parents. Eliminate sister. Eliminate nephews. Secure the estate. That theory paints a portrait of cold, rational calculation. But critics ask, does financial frustration necessarily lead to annihilating one's entire family? Or are we projecting motive after the fact? The alternative psychological narrative. The defense narrative centered around Sheila's mental health. She had a documented history of psychosis. During previous episodes, she had reportedly exhibited delusional thinking and religious fixations. Schizophrenia can, in rare circumstances, involve severe paranoia or violent ideation during untreated or acute phases. The defense argued that on August 7, 1985, Sheila suffered a catastrophic breakdown. In this interpretation, the murders were not planned. They were the tragic result of untreated or escalating illness. That narrative does not require financial motive. It requires a mental health crisis. And because Sheila could no longer speak for herself, her psychological history became her voice in court. Personality and public image. One reason the case divided Britain is because of Jeremy's demeanor. In interviews after the murders, he appeared calm, controlled, articulate. Some observers interpreted that composure as guilt. Others interpreted it as shock. Human beings react differently to trauma. There is no universal grief pattern, but juries often subconsciously evaluate behavior. Was he too calm? Too prepared? Too composed? Prosecutors subtly suggested his behavior indicated staging. Defense lawyers argued that personality traits should not replace evidence. But psychology always seeps into courtroom interpretation. The concept of family annihilators. Criminologists classify family annihilators as individuals who kill multiple family members, often driven by financial pressure, control issues, or desire to avoid perceived shame. In many cases, these crimes involve a patriarchal figure acting out of desperation or ego. But White House Farm did not perfectly fit known patterns. If Jeremy were guilty, the motive was inheritance, not escape from debt, not immediate crisis. And if Sheila were responsible, it would represent a rare case of a mentally ill mother killing both parents and children. Neither explanation feels common, and that rarity contributes to the psychological tension. Control and narrative power. One striking feature of the case is narrative control. Jeremy made the first phone call to police. He introduced the initial version of events. In any crime, the first narrative can shape investigation direction. Critics argue that when suspicion later shifted to Jeremy, investigators retroactively interpreted everything through a lens of guilt. Supporters argue that inconsistencies forced that shift. Psychologically, once a suspect becomes the focal point, confirmation bias can occur. Investigators unconsciously look for evidence that confirms their belief. Courts concluded that evidence was strong enough to withstand that concern. But the debate about bias remains part of the case's psychological complexity. Grief, performance, and perception. When someone loses an entire family overnight, grief can manifest unpredictably. Jeremy's public statements were measured and controlled. Some said he seemed detached. Others said he seemed in shock. High-profile trials often amplify behavioral scrutiny. Every facial expression is interpreted. But psychology teaches that trauma can create emotional flattening. It can also create hyperrational responses. The human mind under stress is unpredictable. Which interpretation is correct? The legal system chose one. Public opinion remains divided. The burden of maintaining innocence. Another psychological layer lies in Jeremy's decades-long insistence that he did not commit the murders. Maintaining innocence for nearly 40 years requires extraordinary consistency. Some argue that such consistency suggests authenticity. Others argue that long-term denial can become part of identity, especially when facing life imprisonment. Psychologists studying convicted individuals note that some prisoners internalize innocence narratives as coping mechanisms, but others are genuinely wrongfully convicted. Distinguishing between those two realities is extraordinarily difficult. The victim's psychological shadows. The case often centers on Jeremy, but psychologically, the most haunting figure may be Sheila. If she was responsible, she represents a catastrophic failure of mental health intervention. If she was not, she represents a woman blamed for unimaginable violence she did not commit. Her psychiatric records were dissected in court. Her personality reduced to diagnostic labels. In either scenario, her life story becomes tragic. And then there are the twin boys, children who had no role in inheritance disputes, no agency in family tensions. Their deaths magnify the emotional impact of every psychological theory. Why the case endures. White House Farm endures because it challenges certainty. Financial motive is plausible. Mental health crisis is plausible. Forensic interpretation is debated. Behavioral perception is subjective. In criminal cases, people crave a clear villain. But this case offers complexity instead. It forces society to confront uncomfortable questions. Can someone appear normal and commit calculated annihilation? Can mental illness escalate into unspeakable violence without warning? Can forensic certainty be overstated? Those questions extend beyond White House Farm. They touch broader fears about family, trust, and hidden motives. The psychological verdict versus the legal verdict. Legally, The verdict is settled. Jeremy Bamber was convicted of 5 murders. His appeals have failed. His whole life sentence stands. Psychologically, however, the case lives in ambiguity. Some believe they understand the motive completely. Others believe doubt remains. And that tension between legal closure and psychological uncertainty is why the White House farm murders continue to fascinate and disturb decades later. Legally, nothing has changed. Jeremy Bamber remains in prison under a whole life sentence. Appeals have been exhausted. The conviction stands. Publicly, debate continues. Online communities remain active. Documentaries still draw viewers. And each anniversary of August 7th reignites discussion. White House Farm is no longer just a location in Essex. It is a symbol of how crime, media, psychology, and law intersect, and how stories refuse to die when doubt lingers. By the mid-1980s, the courtroom battles had ended, but the legal reverberations of Jeremy Bamber's conviction continued to shape British justice. The White House Farm case did more than resolve a horrific massacre. It highlighted critical aspects of the UK legal system, from sentencing practices to the appeal process and the limitations inherent in addressing psychological complexity in violent crimes. Whole life sentences, the gravity of conviction. Bamber's sentence was a whole life term, one of the harshest in the UK judicial system. Unlike standard life sentences with the possibility of parole, a whole life order meant Bamber would spend the remainder of his natural life behind bars. The UK has always balanced rehabilitation with retribution. While many life sentences provide the possibility of release after decades, a whole life order reflects the court's determination that certain crimes are so egregious that the offender should never return to society. The White House Farm case became a reference point in subsequent discussions about the use of whole life orders. Scholars debated whether this form of justice is punitive, preventative, or symbolic. Critics argued that it leaves little room for rehabilitation or psychological treatment, while proponents emphasized society's right to absolute protection against extremely dangerous offenders. Appeals and the quest for justice. Even after conviction, Bamber's legal story did not end. Over the decades, he pursued appeals and post-conviction motions, attempting to challenge aspects of his trial and evidence. These appeals often focused on procedural points, forensic methods, or alleged errors in the original investigation. For example, supporters of Bamber's legal campaigns argued that police tunnel vision had led investigators to selectively interpret ambiguous evidence. They highlighted potential inconsistencies in witness statements, the handling of forensic materials, and even the logic behind the motive assigned to Bamber, namely the inheritance of the estate. In each instance, British courts examined the appeals meticulously. Yet, despite thorough legal reviews, the original conviction remained intact. These failed appeals underscored the judiciary's stance. While procedural fairness is critical, there must also be deference to the weight of evidence and the jury's original assessment. Psychological assessments and criminal responsibility. A central debate throughout the case was Bamber's mental state and psychological profile. While he was ultimately deemed fully responsible for the murders, experts frequently discussed his personality traits, charm, manipulativeness, and possible sociopathic tendencies. The challenge for the legal system was differentiating between calculated criminality and mental illness. The UK legal framework allows for diminished responsibility in cases of severe psychological disorder, which can reduce murder charges to manslaughter. However, in Bamber's case, no such disorder was accepted as mitigating. He was judged fully capable of understanding his actions and their consequences. This aspect of the case highlighted a broader question: how does the law address offenders who are psychologically atypical but legally sane? White House Farm became a teaching case in law schools and criminology programs, illustrating the delicate balance between moral culpability, mental health, and legal responsibility. Media influence on justice. The case also demonstrated the media's indirect influence on legal outcomes. Though courts strive to remain impartial, high-profile reporting can shape public perception and even affect the trial atmosphere. During the 1985 investigation and the 1986 trial, newspapers sensationalized the story, emphasizing the alleged motive of greed and portraying Bamber as coldly calculating. This created an environment in which jurors and the public were exposed to a powerful narrative before the legal process could present all evidence comprehensively. While the courts took measures to protect jury impartiality, the case illustrated how media framing can indirectly impact perceptions of justice. It also sparked debate about balancing public interest with fair trial rights, a discussion that continues in the UK today. The role of forensic science. Forensic science was pivotal in securing the conviction. Investigators used fingerprints, forensic analysis of bindings, and other physical evidence to reconstruct the events at White House Farm. However, the case also exposed the limitations of forensic methods at the time. Technology in the 1980s lacked today's precision. Blood pattern analysis, DNA testing, and trace evidence identification were less advanced, leaving room for interpretation. Later advocates for Bamber argued that modern techniques could potentially yield different conclusions, particularly regarding the handling of Sheila Caffell and her son's deaths. These claims, though unproven, contributed to the ongoing public debate and fueled documentaries, podcasts, and dramas that questioned aspects of the investigation. The impact on British sentencing policy. White House Farm influenced more than legal theory. It affected sentencing practices and policy discussions. Whole-life sentences, rare at the time, became a tool for addressing extreme cases. Legislators debated the appropriateness of such sentences, weighing them against human rights obligations under European law. Cases like Bamber's provided tangible examples of when society deemed absolute incarceration necessary. The case also prompted reflection on juvenile victim protection, mental health considerations, and the responsibilities of law enforcement in high-stakes homicide investigations. It became a benchmark for evaluating both legal sufficiency and moral reasoning in sentencing. Cultural legacy, beyond courtroom walls. Decades after the murders, White House Farm remains embedded in British cultural consciousness. Documentaries, television dramas, podcasts, and books have kept the story alive. Each retelling examines evidence, psychology, and motive, often blurring the line between fact and interpretation. The case is studied not only for its criminal elements but also for its social implications, exploring family dynamics, mental illness, rural isolation, and the consequences of privilege and entitlement. Lessons for the criminal justice system. Importance of evidence integrity. The case highlights how crucial meticulous evidence handling is for convictions and appeals. Balancing media and justice. It underscores the need for courts to insulate jurors from sensational reporting. Whole-life sentences. White House Farm serves as a reference for when extreme punishment is deemed necessary. Psychological analysis. It demonstrates how offender personality assessments can inform, but not determine, legal outcomes. Ongoing public debate. Even settled cases can fuel societal discussion, illustrating law's interaction with culture. Continuing controversy. Even today, discussions about Jeremy Bamber's guilt or innocence persist. Legal appeals are largely exhausted, yet media, social commentary, and advocacy groups continue to analyze the case. This enduring debate reflects a broader human fascination with uncertainty, morality, and justice. White House Farm, beyond its horrific events, provides a lens through which society examines its values, its trust in institutions, and its understanding of human nature. Looking ahead, as time passes, White House Farm's significance has shifted from a mere murder case to a symbol of tragedy, of legal rigor, and of the interplay between crime, psychology, and culture. In Part 9, we will explore the personal aftermath for the families involved, how they coped with grief, the social stigma of the media spotlight, and the psychological toll of living in the shadow of one of Britain's most infamous murders. The White House Farm murders left scars far beyond the immediate victims. While Jeremy Bamber's conviction made headlines and dominated public attention, the real human cost fell on the surviving family members, friends, and communities left to grapple with a horror that seemed almost unimaginable. Part 9 delves into the emotional, social, and psychological aftermath for those connected to the tragedy, exploring the long-term ripple effects that linger decades after the crime. The immediate shock and loss. In August 1985, when news of the murders spread, the immediate response from the surviving family members was a mixture of disbelief, grief, and confusion. Neighbors, friends, and relatives were forced to confront the fact that 6 members of the same family had been killed in what seemed to be a quiet, rural Essex farmhouse. For the surviving members, particularly distant relatives, the first challenge was understanding the scale of the loss. In the pre-digital era, news traveled slowly, and the media coverage was both extensive and sensationalized. Relatives often learned details about the crime from newspaper headlines before fully understanding the personal impact. The realization that such violence could erupt in a family setting created a lingering sense of vulnerability and mistrust. Family members described feeling trapped in a surreal nightmare. Everyday routines became impossible. The house that had been a place of warmth and history was now a crime scene, cordoned off by police and swarmed with journalists. Even simple visits to friends or local shops were accompanied by intrusive questions, gossip, and speculation about the motives behind the massacre. The media spotlight and public scrutiny. The extensive media coverage, while informative, compounded the trauma. British newspapers and tabloids sensationalized many aspects of the case, focusing on the alleged motives of inheritance and greed. Headlines painted Jeremy Bamber as the calculating mastermind, and by association, they cast shadows on the surviving relatives. Surviving family members were thrust into public scrutiny, their private mourning displayed for national consumption. In some cases, they were misquoted or misrepresented, which added to the stress. This exposure made it difficult for relatives to grieve in privacy or even to find safe spaces away from public attention. Psychologists have noted that secondary trauma from media exposure is often significant, particularly when it involves such personal and violent events. Some family members reported anxiety and hypervigilance, fearing that violence could strike again even after Bamber's arrest. The constant media attention made it challenging to feel any sense of normalcy or closure, prolonging their trauma well beyond the initial shock. Coping with grief and loss. Grieving a mass murder within a family is uniquely complex. The surviving members had to navigate layers of loss, not just the deaths themselves, but also the manner in which the murders occurred, bound, gagged, and executed with apparent premeditation. Psychologists describe the phenomenon of compounded grief in such cases. Surviving relatives experience intense sorrow, often mixed with anger, guilt, and confusion. They may struggle with survivors' guilt, asking themselves why they were spared when others were not. Many report difficulty sleeping, recurring nightmares, and a persistent fear of social interactions or forming new attachments. The extended families tried to support one another, but the intensity of grief created strain even among close relatives. Marriages were tested, friendships fractured, and some members moved away entirely to escape the constant reminders of the tragedy. The role of community support. In rural Essex, communities often function as tight-knit networks, and the White House Farm tragedy reverberated across social and geographical boundaries. Neighbors, local authorities, and community organizations attempted to provide support to grieving families. Counseling services were offered. Although in the 1980s, psychological support for trauma victims was less comprehensive than today, religious institutions, such as local churches, became informal centers of solace, providing rituals, memorial services, and a listening ear to those struggling with their grief. Despite these efforts, many survivors found it challenging to reintegrate into community life. Suspicion, rumors, and the constant association with the infamous case created ongoing social pressure. Even decades later, some survivors avoided mentioning White House Farm, choosing to distance themselves from the notoriety attached to their family name. Legal proceedings and emotional turmoil. While Bamber's trial and conviction were crucial for delivering justice, the legal proceedings themselves were another source of stress. Families were required to relive the horror repeatedly, testifying in court, reviewing crime scene evidence, and confronting media reports. The lengthy investigation and trial, spanning months, meant that closure was delayed. For many relatives, the appeals and ongoing legal challenges brought by Bamber prolonged uncertainty and emotional instability. Every motion or legal maneuver forced families to revisit the trauma, even as the rest of the public began to move on. One recurring theme among survivors was the duality of relief and frustration. Relief came from seeing justice served, while frustration stemmed from the continued media speculation and the seemingly endless attention to the perpetrator rather than the victims themselves. Psychological and emotional consequences. The psychological effects of surviving such a tragedy are profound and long-lasting. Research indicates that relatives of mass murder victims are at higher risk for post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Many White House Farm relatives reported ongoing nightmares, flashbacks, and intrusive memories. Everyday experiences, passing the farm, hearing distant sirens, or reading news about crime, could trigger intense emotional reactions. Some individuals developed hyper-awareness and heightened vigilance, fearing potential danger even in ordinary circumstances. The trauma often affected interpersonal relationships, with survivors expressing difficulty trusting new acquaintances or forming romantic partnerships. Additionally, secondary stress emerged from public interactions. Being recognized as part of the White House Farm family elicited sympathy, questions, and sometimes morbid curiosity, which could exacerbate feelings of helplessness and resentment. Coping mechanisms and recovery. Over time, families employed various coping mechanisms to process their grief and trauma. Therapeutic support. Many sought professional counseling to address anxiety, PTSD, and depression. Cognitive behavioral therapy and trauma-focused therapy became essential tools for healing. Family unity. Remaining close to other surviving relatives provided emotional support and a sense of shared resilience. Privacy and distance. Some chose to relocate or reduce media exposure to reclaim personal space and control over their narrative. Memorialization. Creating personal memorials and rituals helped preserve the memory of lost loved ones while providing structured ways to mourn. Despite these efforts, recovery was uneven. Trauma is rarely linear, and anniversaries, news reports, or legal updates could reignite grief even decades later. Long-term social impact. Beyond immediate grief, the massacre had lasting social consequences. The community around White House Farm became synonymous with the crime in the public imagination. Locals often experienced intrusive curiosity from tourists, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts. Some family members became reluctant to visit Essex or speak publicly about the case. Others used the platform to advocate for victims' rights, trauma awareness, and criminal justice reform, seeking to transform personal suffering into broader societal impact. Cultural reflection and media legacy. White House Farm continues to inspire documentaries, podcasts, and dramatizations. These retellings often focus on Bamba's motives, forensic analysis, and legal proceedings. While informative, they also remind surviving family members of the persistent cultural fascination with violence and the dangers of sensationalism. The media's portrayal of the case sparked discussions on ethical reporting, victim representation, and the balance between public interest and sensitivity toward grieving families. Many survivors criticized dramatizations that focused on the killer while marginalizing the lived experiences of the victims and their relatives. Lessons learned from family trauma. The importance of mental health support, immediate and long-term psychological care is vital for surviving family members. Respecting privacy, communities and media outlets must balance public interest with the emotional well-being of grieving relatives. Societal awareness of secondary trauma. Understanding the ripple effect of violent crimes helps support both direct and indirect victims. Resilience and advocacy. Families can transform trauma into advocacy, raising awareness about victim rights and legal reform. The ongoing legacy. Even decades after the murders, the emotional aftershocks continue. The White House Farm case is a cautionary tale about the long-term consequences of violent crime on families. Survivors have shared stories of fractured relationships, lingering fear, and the struggle to maintain normalcy in a world where their tragedy remains iconic. In Part 10, the focus will shift to the broader societal and legal implications, including how the case influenced British criminal law, forensic methodology, and public perceptions of violent crime, demonstrating that the impact of White House Farm extended far beyond the immediate family. The White House Farm murders not only devastated a family, but also left an indelible mark on the British criminal justice system. Part 10 examines the legal repercussions of the case, the influence it had on policing, forensic methods, and the evolution of criminal proceedings in the UK. It explores how Jeremy Bamba's trial and conviction highlighted gaps in investigative procedures and shaped public perceptions of justice. Early investigation challenges. When the murders were first discovered in August 1985, law enforcement faced significant obstacles. The crime scene at White House Farm was both gruesome and complex. Multiple victims, each with distinct injuries and varying states of decomposition, presented challenges for forensic analysis. Initial police investigations focused on family members. In cases involving domestic mass murder, the immediate assumption is often that someone within the household is responsible. Detectives meticulously reviewed family dynamics, financial motives, and interpersonal tensions. In White House Farm's case, inheritance and property issues quickly came under scrutiny, particularly because Jeremy Bamber stood to gain significantly from the deaths of his adoptive parents and sister. The early stages of the investigation highlighted weaknesses in interdepartmental communication. Essex police had to collaborate with other counties, as some victims had connections outside Essex. Coordination with neighboring jurisdictions, especially concerning missing persons reports, became essential to construct an accurate timeline. The trial of Jeremy Bamber. Jeremy Bamber's trial began in 1986 and quickly became one of the most high-profile cases in UK criminal history. The prosecution painted a portrait of a calculating and cold individual, alleging that he had murdered his parents, sister, and her children to secure financial gain and control of the family estate. The defense argued that the murders were the result of Sheila Caffell, Jeremy's sister, acting alone in a tragic murder-suicide. Bamber's attorneys claimed he had no involvement and that circumstantial evidence had been misinterpreted by investigators. Despite the defense's arguments, the prosecution presented compelling evidence. Forensic evidence, ballistics reports, fingerprints, and firearm analysis indicated that the murders were more consistent with a premeditated plan rather than a single accidental act. Financial motive. Documentation of inheritance and property rights showed that Bamber would benefit significantly from the deaths of his family members. Witness testimonies. Neighbors and acquaintances provided accounts of Bamber's demeanor and interactions leading up to the murders, which the prosecution used to establish intent and premeditation. The trial's length and intensity captivated the nation. Every detail, from gunpowder residue on clothing to Bamber's movements on the day of the murders, was analyzed in court. Media coverage was relentless, and the case became a touchstone for discussions on both familial crime and legal procedure. Conviction and sentencing. In October 1986, after weeks of deliberation, the jury found Jeremy Bamber guilty on multiple counts of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for a minimum term of 25 years. The sentencing underscored the severity of the crime. The presiding judge described the murders as cold, calculated, and appallingly executed, emphasizing the need for society to be protected from such acts of extreme violence. Bamber's conviction sent a clear message to the public. Familial ties do not exempt individuals from the consequences of violent crime. The case also illustrated the importance of meticulous investigation and the role of forensic science in securing justice. Appeals and controversy. Despite the conviction, Jeremy Bamber has maintained his innocence, leading to numerous appeals over the decades. These appeals have centered on alleged flaws in forensic methods, potential biases in the investigation, and claims that alternative theories, such as Sheila Caffell's involvement, were not adequately considered. 1990s appeals. Early appeals focused on procedural errors and questioned the handling of key evidence, including firearms analysis and crime scene preservation. 2000s appeals. Later appeals incorporated advancements in DNA testing, hoping to uncover evidence that might suggest a different perpetrator or scenario. Recent developments. Even in the 2010s and 2020s, Bamber's legal team has continued to file petitions for review, claiming new evidence could exonerate him. The appeals process has sparked public debate about the balance between legal finality and the possibility of wrongful conviction. While courts have consistently rejected Bamber's claims, the persistence of these appeals has kept the case in the public eye and raised questions about the reliability of forensic science in high-profile trials. Impact on policing and investigative procedures. White House Farm influenced the evolution of British policing in several key ways. Interagency collaboration. The case demonstrated the importance of communication between local and regional police forces. Investigators learned that sharing missing persons reports, forensic data, and witness accounts across jurisdictions was critical in complex cases. Forensic advancements. Challenges in identifying victims and determining timelines highlighted the need for improved forensic methods. Subsequent cases benefited from more sophisticated DNA testing, ballistics analysis, and evidence preservation techniques. Training for domestic crime investigations, the unique familial dynamics of the case led to improved protocols for handling suspected intrafamily murders, emphasizing sensitivity while maintaining investigative rigor. Media influence on legal proceedings. The media coverage of White House Farm was unprecedented. Daily newspapers, television broadcasts, and documentaries ensured that the case reached a national audience. While this brought public attention to the severity of the crime, it also raised concerns. Pre-trial publicity, extensive reporting prior to the trial risked influencing public opinion and potential jurors. Sensationalism versus accuracy. Many outlets emphasized dramatic aspects of the crime, sometimes overshadowing the methodical legal process. Long-term legacy. The media portrayal contributed to enduring public fascination, which has kept the case in cultural discourse decades after the events. Legal scholars argue that White House Farm became a case study in balancing transparency and media access with the need for a fair trial. Influence on victim advocacy and support systems. One of the lasting consequences of the White House Farm murders is the awareness it raised about victim support. Prior to the case, victims' families often received minimal assistance navigating the emotional and legal aftermath of violent crime. Following the trial, advocacy for structured support systems increased. Psychological counseling, emphasis on trauma-informed care for surviving relatives. Legal guidance, support for families in understanding court proceedings and participating in trials. Community programs, local initiatives aimed at fostering resilience among those affected by violent crimes. These measures, partly inspired by the White House Farm case, have improved resources for families in similar situations across the UK. Lessons learned. White House Farm continues to provide valuable insights for both legal professionals and society. Comprehensive investigation, thorough crime scene analysis, and cross-jurisdictional cooperation are essential in complex cases. Forensic reliability, proper collection, storage, and interpretation of evidence can make or break a case. Judicial process transparency. Public confidence depends on both fair trials and careful media reporting. Victim support importance. Addressing the long-term psychological impact on survivors is as critical as securing convictions. The enduring fascination. Even decades later, White House Farm captivates public imagination. The combination of familial betrayal, extreme violence, and legal drama ensures that it remains a central case in discussions of criminal psychology and forensic science. Documentaries, podcasts, and books continue to explore the story, often highlighting the unresolved questions and human tragedies behind the headlines. For the surviving families, however, the focus is less on sensationalized narratives and more on healing, remembrance, and rebuilding lives in the shadow of an unimaginable crime. Their journey underscores the profound, enduring consequences of violent acts and the resilience required to survive such personal trauma.